I've been arguing over the last few days that modern science contains within it a kind of commitment to materialism and to naturalism. And I've argued that this creates a sort of procedural atheism in modern science. Why? Because when you're committed to a materialist universe, naturalistic explanations, you write off the possibility of miracles or the supernatural or the transcendent right off the bat. You don't consider those. And now I want to say why I think that that's okay. It's okay for science to be procedurally atheist in this way, as long as it's not confused with a kind of metaphysical atheism. In other words, procedural atheism, which is to say materialism and naturalism, are a good operational way to let science do its job, as long as we understand that science's job is not the only job. Now, scientists who are religious know this, and they don't have any problem with the parameters of science, as long as science itself recognizes those parameters. By the way, biologist Francis Collins, former head of the NIH, he says, hey, look, I can investigate biological forces, biological causes, even natural explanations for transitions among life forms. And yet I don't believe that that's the only explanation. I don't believe that supernatural forces are not at work. He says, quote, science is not the only way of knowing. Here's astronomer Owen Gingerich, who spent his life at Harvard. Science works within a constrained framework in creating its brilliant picture of nature. This does not mean that the universe is actually godless, just that science within its own framework has no other way of working. And yet Gingerich says, hey, when I look at that same universe, I see that, quote, reality goes much deeper than the scientific portrait of it. Now, the unfortunate thing is that just as you have religious scientists, you have atheist scientists who look at science as a kind of truncheon, a sword with which to slay theism and specifically Christianity. And they admit it. That's what's so interesting in my book, What's So Great About Christianity. As you can see, I always give you quotes. I give you chapter and verse. So here's the biologist Francis Crick, winner of the Nobel Prize. Watson and Crick, of course, discovered the structure of the DNA molecule. Here's Crick. He says, his commitment to materialism and hostility to religion motivated him to enter this field, meaning science. He became a scientist because he was anti-religious. Quote, I went into science because of these religious reasons. There's no doubt about that. I asked myself, what were the things that appear inexplicable and that are used to support religious beliefs? So Crick is saying, I figured if I go into science, I can try to provide naturalistic explanations for things that religious believers attribute to God. In the same vein, physicist Steven Weinberg from Cornell, he says that his hope is that science will liberate people from religion, unquote. This is one of the things that in fact has driven me in my life. So his commitment to being a scientist exists kind of inside this philosophical commitment to trying to knock down, if you will, religious claims and religious dogmas. The problem, as I mentioned a moment ago, is that the adversaries of religion, Crick, Weinberg, guys like Dennett, Dawkins, they conflate procedural atheism with philosophical atheism. They act as if the two are the same thing. And they act as if because science has a way of knowing, that's the only way of knowing. And therefore, when science says things like, we can't look at miracles, they conclude there are no miracles. We can't look at the supernatural, there is no supernatural. We can't look at transcendence, there is no transcendence. So this is a kind of a logical fallacy. It's stating something that you don't know. I don't know if there's another life, therefore there is no other life. Discovering whether there's another life is outside the bounds of empirical science, therefore the afterlife does not exist. So you don't need to be a logician to see that this is a non sequitur, but nevertheless, here we go. You find this suffusing the work of the so-called new atheists. Now, I'll close with an example that the physicist John Polkinghorne gives to illustrate the limitations of science. And it's an example I like to give in some of my talks on apologetics. And it's a very simple one. That's why it's so powerful. Basically, John Polkinghorne says, let's say I'm boiling a cup of tea, and I now ask a simple question. why is the water boiling? He says, here's the scientific answer. The scientific answer is in terms of molecules and temperatures. The scientific explanation is the molecules are expanding, and so they create this boiling effect. So the explanation is given in materialistic or naturalistic terms. But Polkinghorne says, look, there's another explanation of why the water is boiling, and that's because Dinesh is making tea. And that is not only a valid explanation, it is in fact the explanation. If Dinesh wasn't making tea, none of these other physical effects of molecules expanding would even be taking place. In fact, he wouldn't have turned on the oven, or he wouldn't have turned on the burner in the first place. So the scientific explanation is right. It's a valid description of reality, but it's an inadequate explanation. It doesn't supply motive. It doesn't show why this thing is going on in the first place. So the point is that science does not even claim to give a full explanation of reality. It's only describing one aspect of reality.